Okay, in this video, we're going to look at solving quadratic equations in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 by using the quadratic formula. Now, some of you may remember this formula or have used it before, and you probably want to bang your head into the wall. Okay, and it looks really confusing when you first look at it or if you haven't done it before. Okay, but it's just a matter of substituting numbers for a, b, and c into this equation. Okay, we're solving for x, so it's going to be x equals. Okay, and your values in your equation here, your formula, come from your equation. A is the coefficient of x squared, b is the coefficient of x, and c is the constant. Okay, and that's just substituting into the letters down, into the variables down here. Okay, so solving each of the following quadratic equations, rounding to the nearest hundredth. So we have x squared minus 6x plus 5 equals 0. The first thing you want to make sure of is that it's in the proper form. Okay, make sure that is in this form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay, equaling 0 is very important. So we have 1x squared minus 6x plus 5 equals 0. So it is in the proper form. So then you identify the values for a, b, and c. Okay, here, a, the coefficient of x squared is 1 because that's 1x squared. B is the coefficient of x, which is negative 6. Okay, don't miss the signs on these. And then c is the number by itself, which is positive 5, okay, the constant. So then it's just a matter of plug and chug into the formula. X equals negative b will be a negative 6. Okay, so a negative 6 plus or minus the square root of b squared. So b is negative 6. Okay, we're going to square that. And always put that number in parentheses, and I guarantee you won't miss it that way. Okay, so negative 6 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, and then times c, which is positive 5. And that's all divided by 2a, so 2 times 1. Okay, and once you do that substitution, okay, now the next step I want to see is the next simplified piece. Negative 6 is 6, plus or minus the square root. I do not care what negative 6 squared is. I don't care what 4 times 1 times 5 is. All I want to see in the next step is what is negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 5. And to do that, put it right in your calculator. Okay, you can do it in your head if you want, but put it, I'm going to suggest you use your calculator. Remember, in parentheses, we're going to put negative 6. We're going to square that. And then minus 4 times 1 times 5. Can we get 16 when we do that? Okay, so we have 6 plus or minus the square root of 16, all divided by 2. Okay, so now the next thing I want to see is when you try to simplify this, is the square root of 16, does that give you a nice answer? Does that give you a rational answer? Meaning, not a decimal that keeps on going on, never repeating. Okay, so if we did the square root of 16 in our calculator, okay, square root of 16, it gives us 4. So we can go to the next step and say x equals 6 plus or minus 4, all divided by 2. Okay, so all we did there was simplify the square root of 16 to get 4. Okay, now, that plus or minus is where your two answers come from. So we want to do the addition, 6 plus 4, divided by 2. And then we want to do x equals 6 minus 4, divided by 2. Okay, so let's just break it apart into two different answers. And then x equals, well, 6 plus 4 gives us 10. Divided by 2 will be 5. And then on the other one, 6 minus 4 is 2. Divide that by 2, you get 1. Okay, now if you do that in your calculator, okay, students miss this a lot also. They'll do this. I'll do 6 plus 4 divided by 2. And if you enter it this way, 6 plus 4 divided by 2, notice what happens, we get 8. Well, I just said the answer was 5. Well, one of us is right. It's either your teacher or the calculator. I don't know how much confidence you have in your teacher. Okay, but your teacher is correct in this case because your calculator here is doing order of operations. It's doing 4 divided by 2 and giving you 2, and then doing 6 plus that. Okay, 6 plus 2 to give you 8. But the way the formula is set up, this whole numerator, negative b plus or minus the square root piece, that's all divided by 2a. So here the 6 plus 4 is all divided by 2. So you need to keep the 6 plus 4 together. So the way that you enter this in your calculator correctly is you can put 6 plus 4 in parentheses to keep it together, and then divide by 2. Okay, and that'll give you the correct answer of 5. Okay, the other way you can do that, you can just do 6 plus 4, press enter, and then divide that answer by 2. Okay, because that'll keep the 6 and 4 together if you press enter afterwards, after you do 6 plus 4. Okay, so there's our two answers, are x equals 5 and x equals 1. Okay, now the significance of those answers, one thing is that that's where you get 0 for an answer for y, because remember, this is like f of x or y equals. So when is the y value 0? When x equals 5 and x equals 1. And what that's telling you is those are where the x-intercepts are on your graph. They're at x equals 1 and x equals 5. Okay, that's where they cross the x-axis. Okay, if you were to put 1 in and check your answer, 1 squared is 1. And then if you do 6 times 1, that'll be 6. So we have 1 minus 6, which is negative 5, plus 5 will give you 0. Okay, so that does check. And if you plug in the 5, okay, that'll work also just very quickly. 5 squared is 25, 6 times 5 is 30, so 25 subtract 30 is negative 5, plus 5 will give you 0 again. Okay, so those two answers check. Okay, part B. Okay, if we go through the process on this one, do we have the correct form first? Well, do we have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0? Yep, 1x squared plus 6x minus 40 equals 0. So that's in the correct form. And I should point out that when you say, well, gee, March, you have a minus 40 there, and you had a minus 6x over in this one instead of pluses. Well, remember that when you subtract, that's really like adding a negative. So you can really look at this as like plus negative 40. Okay, then it's in the correct form, okay, if you want to look at it that way. Okay, so the values of a, b, and c, a equals 1, b equals positive 6 in this case, and then c equals negative 40. Okay, so if you go through and do the substitution on this one, x equals negative b will be negative 6, plus or minus the square root. B squared will be 6 squared, minus 4 times 1 times negative 40, okay, because c is negative 40. And that's all divided by 2 times a, which is 2 times 1. Okay, so when you do the simplifying on this one, when you do inside the square root, okay, again, I'm just going to show you one more time in the calculator, okay, just to show you. Okay, you're going to do 6 squared. Okay, and again, I suggest you put that in parentheses every time. So 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 40. Now notice I used the white negative key for the negative 40. The minus 4ac, the minus sign, is this one right here. Okay. And then press enter and it gives you 196. Okay, so we have x equals negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 196, all divided by 2. Okay, so to finish that one off, we want to try the square root of 196. Okay, so the square root of 196, okay, that gives us 14. So x equals negative 6 plus or minus 14, all divided by 2. So breaking apart our two different answers, x equals negative 6 plus 14, all divided by 2, and x equals negative 6 minus 14, all divided by 2. And when we do that, negative 6 plus 14 gives you 8, divided by 2 will give you x equals 4. And on the other one, negative 6 minus 14 will give you negative 20, divided by 2, which is negative 10. Okay, so there's your two answers. Okay, and again, the significance there is if you were to graph this equation, x equals 4 and x equals negative 10 would be your x-intercepts. Okay, that's where your U-shape, your parabola, would cross through the x-axis. Okay, part C, notice in this one, when we look at is it in the proper form or not, notice we have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 4, not 0. Okay, we have to have it equal to 0. That's extremely important. So what we need to do is subtract 4 first on this one. So we're going to work with x squared minus 7x plus 12 equals 0. Okay, so you have to get it equal to 0 first. Okay, and then a is 1, b is negative 7, and c is positive 12. Okay, so for the sake of time, if you go through and substitute those in, this one we get a 1 inside of the square root, and the square root of 1 is just 1. So we do 7 plus x equals 7 plus or minus 1, all divided by 2. Okay, so there we get answers of x equals 4 and x equals 3. Okay, and if you're not getting that, make sure you're putting negative 7 in parentheses when you square it. Okay, on the bottom half of the page, okay, again we have 6x squared equals 10 minus 7x. That is not in the proper form. So you can, if you wanted to, you could subtract 6x squared from each side and then put it in standard form. My suggestion will be to add 7x and then subtract 10 from each side. That's my suggestion. So you have 6x squared plus 7x and then minus 10 equals 0. And then your a value is 6, b is 7, and c is negative 10. Okay, so I'm just going to skip ahead here. I did the substitution, and if you want to pause the video, go ahead. Okay, but I'm going to show the answer here. Okay, this one works out a little bit differently. Okay, this one, when you solve it, you end up with a square root of 289, which is a perfect square, okay, because 17 squared will give you 289. But then when you add negative 7 plus 17, that'll give you 10, and then divide by 12. Well, that's a fraction. You can leave it as 10/12. You can reduce it to 5/6 if you want. Now, the directions up here did say round to the nearest hundredth, if appropriate. Okay, so here, if you did round this to the nearest hundredth, well, 10 divided by 12 or 5 divided by 6 will give you 0.83 to the nearest hundredth. Okay, and then x equals negative 2 is your other solution. Okay, on part E, this one is in the proper form. We have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So a is 3, b is negative 5, and c is negative 9. So when you go through and substitute those into your formula, and again, if you need to pause, go ahead. But for the sake of time, I'm going to show the answers. Okay, when we do this one, you end up with the square root of 133 in your answer. Well, if we do the square root of 133, okay, square root of 133, press enter. It doesn't change it at all, so square root of 133, you can leave it like that in exact form, but it did say to round to the nearest hundredth if appropriate. Okay, so the way you can do that in your calculator, if we do 5 plus the square root of 133 and then divide by 6, okay, we can do this, parentheses 5 plus the square root of 133 oops. Okay, after you do 133, use your arrow key to go to the right and then the parentheses and then divide by 6. You want to make sure that you're outside of the square root now. Okay, now that doesn't really help us much. But remember that arrow button at the bottom? Okay, if we press that, that'll give us 2.7554. So to the nearest hundredth, that second 5 would round that first 5 up to a 6. So 2.76. Okay, and similarly, you can do the 5 minus square root of 133 over 6, and you get negative 1.09 for that one. Okay, I'm not going to show you on the calculator because you can do that. Okay, then the very last one. Again, we do not have the proper form, so we have to get it in proper form first. So my suggestion would be to add the 2x squared and subtract the 3x. And what that'll do, it'll keep your a term positive. Okay, that's generally my suggestion, is to make the a term positive. So the a value is positive when you add 2x squared each side. You don't have to do that, okay, but it'll make, I think it'll help with your calculations. So if you add 2x squared each side and subtract 3x, well, 2x subtract 3x will be minus 1x in the center there in the middle, for the middle term. Add 2x will give you positive 2x squared if you add 2x squared each side. Okay, so your a is 2, b is negative 1, and c is negative 5. So again, pause the video if you need to, but I'm going to show the answers. And this one up with the square root of 41, which, just like the square root of 133, it doesn't end up being a nice number. Okay, so you can do the same thing you did on that last question. Put 1 plus the square root of 41 in your calculator, divided by 4, you get 1.85. And for the other answer, you get negative 1.35. Again, those are rounded to the nearest hundredth. Okay, move along to the second side. Okay, question number 2. Okay, since the quadratic formula involves a square root, sometimes there's no real number solution. Okay, and what that means is, remember before when you had like x squared equals negative 4? Well, is there a number you can multiply by itself to get negative 4? When you try to solve that, you can't do the square root of negative 4. So that was a non-real solution. Well, let's look at the quadratic formula and see what happens on this one. If we identify a, b, and c, a is 3, b is negative 4, and c is positive 5. So substituting those into the formula, we get x equals negative b, so negative 4, plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared, minus 4 times 3 times 5. All divided by 2a, which will be 2 times 3. So x equals a negative 4 is positive 4, plus or minus the square root. Well, when we do the negative 4 squared minus 4 times 3 times 5, we end up with the square root of negative 44. And that's all divided by 6. Well, the square root of negative 44 is similar to the idea of the square root of negative 4. There's nothing we can multiply by itself to get negative 44. So that right there, okay, because of that square root of the negative, because of that, that tells us we have a non-real solution. Okay, or no real solution. Okay, so that can happen when you use the quadratic formula also. Okay, getting a non-real solution. Okay, moving on to number 3. Okay, we're going to leave our answers this time in exact form, which means we're not going to round anything. Okay, so here, in part A, we have 1x squared minus 6x plus 3 equals 0. So when you go through and substitute that in, okay, substitute the numbers into the formula. Okay, again, for the sake of time, I'm just going to put the answer up. And again, you can pause the video if you need to. Okay, here, we end up with a square root of 24. Now notice in that next step, we have x equals 6 plus or minus 2 square root of 6 over 2. So the only thing that changed from this step to this step was the square root of 24. We wrote in a simplified form of 2 square root of 6. And the way you can get that in your calculator here again is if you do square root 24 and press enter, it simplifies it to 2 square root of 6. Okay, they're actually the same. They're the same number, just written differently. Okay, 2 square root of 6 is a broken down or simplified form of square root of 24. Okay, well now you can actually simplify that a little bit more. Notice how we have this whole numerator, 6 plus 2 square root of 6, divided by 2, and 6 minus 2 square root of 6, all divided by 2. So that dividing by 2 is underneath, or is the denominator, for both terms in the numerator. So if you do 6 divided by 2, that gives us 3. And then 2 square root of 6 divided by 2 gives us just the square root of 6. Okay, so what I did there, I'll just show you the steps here. 6 over 2 plus or minus 2 square root of 6 over 2. Okay, what happens there is, again, it's because that 2 is underneath both parts, both terms. 6 divided by 2 is 3. And then 2 square root of 6 divided by 2, the 2's reduce out. So we're multiplying 2 times the number and then dividing by 2. Okay, so just if you look at it as like 2x divided by 2, the 2's would reduce out and just give you x. Okay, so here we have 2 square root of 6 divided by 2, the 2's reduce out and just give you the square root of 6. Okay, you do not reduce, like you cannot do 6 divided by 2 gives you 3 because we have a square root of 6. And that is just 2 that is not inside the square root. So you cannot divide the square root of 6 by 2. Okay, and you can only divide the 2 outside of the square root by the 2. Okay, so there's your answer for that one. Okay, next one, similar idea. Okay, and what I'll suggest is you go through and actually do parts B and C. Okay, then I'll put the answers up. Okay, they are both in the correct form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay, they're both in the correct form. Okay, so we'll go through and substitute your values in. And the idea of these 3 questions here is just to practice breaking down and simplifying the square root. Okay, by using your calculator. Okay, so you can pause the video and I'll put the answers up. Okay, on number 8, once you simplify the square root of 40 into 2 square root of 10, when you do negative 8 divided by 4, you get negative 2. And then in the second piece, the 2 and the 4 reduce to 1 over 2. Okay, so you're left with 1 square root of 10 divided by 2. And then in part C, the square root of 56 reduces to 2 square root of 14. And then when you simplify that, the 4 and 10 reduce to 2/5, and then the 2 and 10 reduce to 1/5. Now, if you want to write a 1 in front of that, you can. Okay, just like over here, if you want to put a 1 in front, you can. Okay, it's not necessary, and generally you don't write it there, but if you want to, you can. Okay, and then the last 2 here are number 4. Okay, these are looking at kind of special cases. When you look at x squared minus 8 equals 0, when you identify the a, b, and c values, well here, a is 1, b is 0 because there's 0x in the equation. There's 0 x's, so b is 0. And then c is negative 8. Okay, so you can look at this kind of as 1x squared plus 0x minus 8 equals 0. Okay, so the b value in the middle there is 0 because of 0 x's. Okay, so I want to look at a and b here just to show you what happens if the b value is 0. And then in the second part here, x squared minus 4x equals 0. Well, that's like a plus 0 on the end. So that tells you the c value is 0. Okay, so these are just 2 cases where the b is 0 and the c is 0, and we see what happens when we solve those. Okay, so again, take a minute and use the quadratic formula to solve those. I'll put the answers up and then make a few comments. Okay, so here are the answers. So in part A, with the b value equaling 0, a negative 0 is just 0. and then add or subtract the square root of, in this case, 32. And if you use your calculator to break that down, that'll give you 4 square root of 2. Well, when you